Hi everyone, welcome to our 5-Minute Bible Study series. Today we are talking about 1 Chronicles chapter 10, and hoorah, we have made it out of the genealogy section of the first 9 chapters of the book. Congratulations. In chapters 10 through 29, we're going to talk about the reign of King David. It's going to be really similar to what we talked about in 2 Samuel. In fact, some of the chapters are almost like word-for-word copies. But there are additional details that are added here that we don't get in 2 Samuel. And that's why we're covering this book after 2 Samuel instead of going right into the Kings. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the death of King Saul, which then sets the stage for David to take the throne. 1 Chronicles was written several hundred years after David's reign, but it details the period of his reign, which would have been from about 1055 to 1015 BC. We've got some important characters to talk about. We're going to talk about Saul. He's the first king of Israel. He's going to die in this chapter, so we're not going to talk about him a lot throughout the rest of the book. He was anointed originally by Samuel, the prophet. Then Jonathan. Jonathan was David's best friend and Saul's son. The Philistines, they're going to fight with the Israelites in this chapter. They were the longtime enemies of the Israelites. They lived towards around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in the territory of Judah in cities like Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, which you can see on the map. And then finally, the men of Jabesh Gilead. They honored Saul in his death by burying him and his sons. Now, as far as our map, we've been spending a lot of time near Jerusalem, but we're going to move a little bit to the north in this chapter, talk about Mount Gilboa, where there was a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. You'll see that up by Jezreel, south of Endor, close to the Jordan River. Now, the men of Jabesh Gilead, they took Saul and his sons' bodies from Bethshan. Bethshan is right next to the Jordan River to the northeast of Mount Gilboa. They took their bodies across the river and buried them at Jabesh, or Jabesh Gilead, which is there in the northern part of Gad's territory. If you were with us for the last chapter of 1 Samuel, I believe, we talked about the death of Saul, this exact story that we're going to talk about here in chapter 10 of 1 Chronicles. There's 14 verses in the chapter. It's all about the death of Saul. Going to be a familiar story. But if you haven't heard the story, here we go. Saul led his army against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, but the battle didn't go the way that he hoped. His men were routed, and his sons were killed by the Philistines. Saul himself was actually mortally wounded by an archer, and he asked his armor-bearer to go ahead and finish him off, to kill him. But his armor-bearer didn't want to do it. Saul was worried about falling into the hands of the Philistines and, potentially being tortured or abused in some way, and so he wanted to die right then and there. So since his armor-bearer wouldn't do it, Saul fell on his own sword and died. Verse 6 says, "Thus Saul died, he and his 3 sons, and all his house died together. And when the Philistines who lived near Mount Gilboa in the nearby cities saw that the Israelite army was defeated, they fled, and the Philistines then took possession of their cities and lived in them." So you kind of see like a reversal. The Israelites, God was on their side. He gave them the land. He helped them defeat the Philistines and the other foreign nations. And now the foreign nations, because of Saul's wickedness and because of his refusal to listen to God, the Philistines are allowed to take back some of that land and take back some of those cities. According to 1 Samuel chapter 31, the Philistines hung the bodies of Saul and his sons in Bethshan. And when the men of Jabesh Gilead heard about this, they took their valiant men and they went to Bethshan. They took the bodies down and then they brought them back to Jabesh. They burned the bodies, buried the bones, and fasted for 7 days. And God's reasons for allowing Saul and his sons to be killed are very clearly stated in the last 2 verses of the chapter. It says this in verses 13 through 14. "So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium, seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore, the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse." So as I mentioned previously, this now sets the stage for David to take the throne of Israel, and it's his story that we're going to be following all the way up to 1 Chronicles chapter 29, where the death of David is recorded. So let's finish up today with an application. It's interesting to me that Saul was killed in a military operation of the Philistines, and yet the author says, quote, "The Lord put him to death." So the Lord was using the Philistines to accomplish his will. And what we learn from that is that wicked rulers are alive only as long, excuse me, I can't speak. Wicked rulers are only alive as long as God permits them to live. He can and will eliminate them when he chooses, and I think that's still happening today. God takes rulers out, whether through a military operation or some other means, and they're only allowed to remain in charge of these countries or these areas so long as God permits. His hand is still in all of this. The same is true for the most wicked ruler of all, and that is Satan. He's permitted to exist by God for God's purposes, but his time is limited, and he's going to be put down by Jesus when Jesus returns to destroy the works of darkness. And that is good news.